February 23, 1945. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima clung to Corporal Hershel Williams' boots as he crouched in a shell crater barely 400 yards from Mount Suribachi, where hours earlier, Marines had raised an American flag visible across the entire southern half of the island. Around him, the celebration had already faded into the grim mathematics of survival. 3 battalions of Marines pinned down by interlocking fields of machine gun fire from concrete pillboxes that naval bombardment had failed to destroy. Williams adjusted the 70-pound weight on his back. 2 fuel tanks filled with 4 gallons of thickened gasoline mixed with diesel. A third tank containing compressed nitrogen. The M2 flamethrower represented the pinnacle of American chemical warfare engineering, yet its effective range barely exceeded 20 yards, forcing operators to crawl within bayonet distance of enemy positions that could identify them instantly by their distinctive silhouette. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His battalion commander, gathered with surviving officers in the crater's dubious protection, studied Williams with the clinical assessment of a man calculating acceptable losses. 6 other flamethrower operators in the battalion had already become casualties. 92% casualty rate among flame troops. The numbers told a story that required no elaboration. The question arrived without preamble. Would Williams, as the only remaining flamethrower expert in the battalion, do something about the 7 pillboxes that had stalled their advance across airfield number 1? What the commander could not know, what no American officer yet understood, was that Williams' answer to that question would demonstrate a tactical reality the Japanese High Command had desperately tried to conceal. That the elaborate defensive philosophy Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months perfecting the interconnected cave systems and reinforced concrete fortifications that represented Japan's most sophisticated defensive engineering, contained a fundamental vulnerability that a single weapon could exploit with devastating psychological effect. The flamethrower had become the one American technology that Japanese defenders truly feared. The mathematics of Iwo Jima's importance had been calculated months before the first Marine set foot on volcanic sand. 8 square miles of barren rock positioned precisely 660 nautical miles south of Tokyo. Close enough that B-29 superfortresses, flying from the Mariana Islands, could use it as an emergency landing field when battle damage or mechanical failure left them unable to complete the 1,300-mile return flight. Close enough that P-51 Mustang fighters based there could escort bombing missions over the Japanese homeland, eliminating the defensive vulnerability that had made unescorted daylight raids prohibitively costly. The Japanese understood these calculations perfectly. In late May of 1944, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo summoned Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi to his office and delivered an assignment that carried the weight of national survival. Kuribayashi would command the defense of Iwo Jima. The eyes of the entire nation would focus on his performance. Failure was not merely unacceptable, it was unthinkable. Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June of 1944 and immediately recognized that conventional Japanese defensive doctrine would guarantee defeat. Previous island battles had demonstrated the futility of water's edge defense against American naval and air superiority. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu. Each battle had ended with Japanese garrison forces virtually annihilated within days or weeks of the initial American landing. The general possessed advantages that previous island commanders had lacked: time for preparation, industrial resources to support extensive construction, and most importantly, unique geological conditions that transformed conventional defensive thinking. Iwo Jima's volcanic origins had created a landscape honeycombed with natural caves and lava tubes. Steam vents released sulfurous gases that made underground work nearly unbearable, with temperatures in some tunnels exceeding 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet these same caves, properly developed and connected, could create a defensive system immune to naval bombardment and aerial attack. Kuribayashi devoted 25% of his garrison force to tunneling operations. Mining engineers dispatched from Japan drew elaborate blueprints for underground fortifications that would connect at multiple levels to ensure ventilation and provide alternative routes when American forces sealed primary entrances. The construction proceeded primarily at night to avoid detection by American aerial reconnaissance. By early February of 1945, Japanese engineers had completed 11 miles of interconnected tunnels beneath Iwo Jima's volcanic rock. The network included everything required for sustained operations: ammunition storage chambers, medical facilities, command posts with telephone connections to forward observation positions, barracks capable of housing 300 to 400 men in reinforced underground chambers, fresh water cisterns and supply depots positioned throughout the system, surface fortifications integrated seamlessly with the underground network. 1,500 cave entrances and spider holes provided firing positions for the 21,000 Japanese troops Suribachi commanded. Concrete pillboxes with walls reinforced by layers of steel, concrete, and volcanic sand absorbed naval shell impacts that would have destroyed conventional fortifications. Machine gun positions featured interlocking fields of fire calculated to maximize American casualties while minimizing Japanese exposure. The defensive philosophy departed radically from traditional Japanese military doctrine. Suribachi explicitly forbade banzai charges, the suicidal mass attacks that had characterized previous island battles. Instead, he issued courageous battle vows, instructing each defender to remain at his battle station and kill 10 Americans before dying. Discipline, not fanaticism, would maximize American casualties and delay inevitable defeat as long as possible. American intelligence systematically underestimated Japanese defensive preparations. Aerial reconnaissance identified 2 completed airfields and estimated Japanese garrison strength at 13,000 troops. The actual number exceeded 21,000. The elaborate tunnel network remained completely invisible to American observers, who assumed that pre-invasion bombardment would destroy surface fortifications and render the island relatively easy to capture. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's invasion plan allocated 5 days for complete seizure of Iwo Jima. The assessment seemed reasonable, given past experience and apparent Japanese defensive limitations. Naval gunfire support would suppress defensive positions during the amphibious assault. Marine infantry would advance from southern beaches toward Mount Suribachi, securing the island's narrow southern tip before pushing north to capture the airfields. The reality that awaited 71,000 Marines of Major General Harry Schmidt's 5th Amphibious Corps bore no resemblance to planning assumptions. February 19, 1945, 0900 hours. The first wave of Marines aboard tracked landing vehicles approached Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches, designated green, red, yellow, and blue. Naval gunfire had been pounding the island for 3 consecutive days. B-24 bombers had been striking targets almost nightly since December. Yet, as Marines waded through surf toward volcanic sand beaches, Japanese defenders waited in underground positions completely untouched by the massive preparatory bombardment. The volcanic ash presented immediate problems. Marines sank to their ankles in loose black sand that made movement exhausting and prevented vehicles from gaining traction. Landing craft grounded on the steep beaches and capsized in violent surf. Equipment piled up in chaos as follow-on waves continued landing at 5-minute intervals, regardless of congestion on the beaches. For approximately 1 hour, Japanese defenders held their fire, while American forces accumulated on the narrow beaches with their backs to the ocean. The discipline required to maintain fire discipline, while thousands of enemy troops landed unchallenged, demonstrated Suribachi's absolute control over his garrison. At approximately 1000 hours, when the beaches were packed with men and equipment in concentrations that maximized potential casualties, Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened fire simultaneously from positions across the entire southern portion of the island. The effect was catastrophic. Artillery shells fitted with proximity fuses detonated above marine formations, showering shrapnel across packed concentrations of troops. Mortars fired from reverse slope positions immune to counter-battery fire walked barrages through landing zones. Machine guns, positioned in reinforced pillboxes, raked the beaches with interlocking fields of fire that eliminated dead space where Marines could find cover. The volcanic ash that hindered Marine movement served Japanese defensive purposes perfectly. Artillery and mortar rounds buried themselves in loose sand before exploding, directing blast effects upward and outward to maximize casualties. Marines attempting to dig foxholes found that volcanic ash collapsed as quickly as they could excavate it, providing minimal protection against indirect fire. Time Life correspondent Robert Sherrod, who had covered previous Pacific Island campaigns, described the first day on Iwo Jima as a nightmare in hell. By nightfall, the Marines had sustained over 2,000 casualties. Over 500 men lay dead on beaches they had expected to secure within hours. The remaining Marines clung to a beachhead barely 700 yards deep at its maximum penetration. Yet, American forces continued landing. By the end of the first day, 30,000 Marines had come ashore despite horrific casualties. The sheer weight of American material resources began asserting itself through numbers that Japanese defenders could not match regardless of tactical advantages. The battle devolved into a grinding war of attrition that bore no resemblance to previous island campaigns. Marines advancing inland encountered defensive positions connected to tunnel systems that allowed Japanese troops to reoccupy pillboxes that had been cleared with grenades and small arms fire. Bunkers that Marines bypassed during initial advances suddenly erupted with machine gun fire from rear positions, inflicting casualties among units that believed they had secured those areas. Japanese defensive tactics exploited American psychological assumptions about cleared positions. Marines walking past supposedly destroyed bunkers took fire from Japanese troops who had withdrawn through tunnels, waited for American forces to pass, then returned through alternative entrances to attack from behind. The tactic proved devastatingly effective and generated intense frustration among Marine units that found themselves taking casualties from positions they had already fought to capture. Standard infantry weapons proved inadequate against reinforced concrete pillboxes buried in volcanic rock. Rifle fire ricocheted harmlessly off hardened positions. Hand grenades lacked explosive power to breach reinforced entrances. Even tank cannon rounds failed to penetrate bunkers designed to withstand naval bombardment. The tactical problem facing Marine commanders became brutally simple. How do you destroy or neutralize an enemy who fights from underground positions immune to conventional weapons and connected by tunnel systems that allow unlimited reinforcement and resupply? The answer emerged through desperate necessity rather than doctrinal planning. Flamethrowers. Weapons that could project burning liquid through firing ports and ventilation openings to kill or force out defenders that conventional weapons could not reach. Weapons that consumed oxygen in confined spaces, asphyxiating defenders even when flames did not directly contact them. Weapons that created psychological terror among enemy troops who feared burning alive more than any other form of death. The M2 flamethrower that Corporal Williams carried on February 23rd had entered service only 18 months earlier after extensive development to address shortcomings in earlier models. The M1 flamethrower, deployed in 1943, suffered from unreliable ignition systems that used battery-powered spark mechanisms prone to failure under combat conditions. Operators resorted to using burning paper, cigarette lighters, and thermite grenades to ignite fuel when electrical ignition failed. The M2 incorporated revolutionary improvements. A 5-shot revolver-type magazine mounted at the end of the flame tube held individual ignition cartridges. Each cartridge contained chemicals that ignited reliably when punctured by a spring-loaded firing pin, eliminating battery-dependent systems that failed in wet or dirty conditions. The new ignition system transformed flamethrower reliability from problematic to nearly certain under combat conditions. Fuel composition had evolved equally dramatically. Early flamethrowers used gasoline and diesel mixtures that produced impressive fireballs but lacked range and persistence. The introduction of napalm, an aluminum soap compound that thickened fuel into a gel-like consistency, extended effective range to 40 yards while creating flames that stuck to surfaces and burned at temperatures approaching 2200 degrees Fahrenheit. The weapon's specifications reflected engineering compromises between effectiveness and portability. Empty weight, 43 pounds. Loaded weight, 68 pounds. Fuel capacity, 4 gallons, distributed between 2 tanks. Compressed nitrogen tank providing propellant pressure. Total burn time, approximately 7 to 8 seconds when fired in continuous bursts. Effective range, 20 yards, though maximum range under ideal conditions could reach 40 yards. Tactical employment required courage that bordered on insanity. Flamethrower operators presented unmistakable silhouettes that drew concentrated enemy fire the moment they became visible. The bulky backpack equipment restricted mobility and made operators high-priority targets for Japanese snipers and machine gunners. A single bullet striking fuel tanks could ignite the entire system, incinerating the operator and anyone nearby. Marine doctrine attempted to reduce flamethrower operator casualties through combined arms tactics. Each flamethrower team consisted of an operator and 4 riflemen providing covering fire. The rifleman would suppress enemy positions while the operator maneuvered close enough to engage with flames. After the operator expended his fuel, the team would withdraw to rearm and reassign to another target. Theory and practice diverged violently under Iwo Jima combat conditions. Covering fire proved inadequate against Japanese defenders in hardened positions who could concentrate overwhelming firepower on flamethrower operators during their approach. Volcanic rock terrain provided minimal concealment. Visibility across the island's open terrain meant Japanese observers could identify flamethrower teams from hundreds of yards away and direct fire accordingly. The casualty rate among flamethrower operators reached 92% by the 4th day of battle. 6 of the 7 operators in Williams' battalion had been killed or wounded attempting to suppress pillboxes that blocked the advance across Airfield No. 1. Japanese defenders had learned to prioritize flamethrower operators above all other targets, understanding that eliminating flame weapons removed the only truly effective means of destroying their fortified positions. Corporal Williams accepted his commander's request without hesitation, despite understanding the statistical probability of survival. 4 riflemen accompanied him as he began crawling toward the nearest pillbox, a reinforced concrete structure partially buried in volcanic rock approximately 75 yards from marine lines. The covering Marines laid down suppressing fire, while Williams advanced. Machine gun rounds ricocheted off volcanic rock around his position. Bullets struck his flamethrower tanks with metallic clangs that should have ignited the pressurized fuel but somehow failed to penetrate the armored construction. He continued crawling forward while Japanese defenders concentrated fire on his position with intensity that left the covering riflemen unable to effectively suppress the enemy. At 25 yards from the pillbox, Williams could see the barrel of a Japanese machine gun protruding from a firing slit, barely 8 inches wide. The position had been designed specifically to defeat direct fire weapons, while providing excellent fields of fire for the defenders. Tank rounds could not penetrate the narrow opening. Rifle grenades lacked accuracy at this range. Only a flamethrower could project burning liquid through that opening with sufficient volume to kill or disable the crew. Williams rose to his knees, angled the flame tube upward to achieve optimal trajectory, and pressed both triggers simultaneously. The rear trigger opened fuel valves. The front trigger punctured an ignition cartridge. Thickened napalm erupted from the nozzle as a tight, dark jet stream that transformed into a rolling ball of flame traveling toward the pillbox at 20 feet per second. The fireball entered the narrow firing slit and detonated inside the reinforced concrete structure with a muffled roar that sent black smoke pouring from ventilation openings. The machine gun fire ceased instantly. Williams had killed or incapacitated the entire crew with a single burst lasting approximately 3 seconds. He did not pause to confirm results. Japanese defenders in adjacent positions had observed his attack and were redirecting fire toward his position. Williams crawled toward the next pillbox, reloading his flamethrower while covering Marines attempted to suppress multiple enemy positions simultaneously. The second pillbox featured a ventilation shaft protruding from its roof, a design element intended to provide air circulation for the crew during extended operations. Williams crawled close enough to observe a wisp of smoke escaping from the opening, confirming the position remained occupied. He crept forward until the ventilation shaft stood within arm's reach, inserted the nozzle of his flamethrower directly into the opening, and fired. Napalm poured into the confined space below, consuming oxygen and filling the interior with flames that reached temperatures capable of melting steel. The crew never had opportunity to react. Williams later recalled simply saying, "Got them all," as he withdrew from the position and moved toward the third pillbox. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The covering Marines had been killed. Williams found himself alone, a single Marine with a weapon effective at 20 yards, facing multiple hardened positions defended by troops who would fight to the death. The tactical situation had devolved into pure mathematics of survival. Continue attacking and probably die. Withdraw and allow Marine casualties to accumulate indefinitely while Japanese positions remained intact. Williams continued attacking. Over the next 4 hours, he returned to Marine lines 5 times to reload his flamethrower and obtain fresh weapons when his primary system malfunctioned or exhausted its fuel supply. Each time, he returned to the battle alone, crawling forward to engage pillboxes with methods that varied based on specific tactical situations. Some positions received frontal attacks through firing ports barely large enough to admit the flamethrower nozzle. Others were engaged by inserting the nozzle through ventilation shafts or drainage holes. When Japanese soldiers charged with fixed bayonets attempting to kill him in close combat, Williams engaged them with flames at distances measured in feet, incinerating attackers before they could close to hand-to-hand range. The systematic destruction of 7 pillboxes across 4 hours of continuous combat eliminated the defensive positions that had stalled Marine advance across Airfield No. 1. Infantry units that had been pinned down under machine gun fire resumed their advance toward the northern portion of the island, where even more formidable defences awaited. Yet Williams' personal combat effectiveness represented merely one example of a larger tactical reality emerging across the entire Iwo Jima battlefield. Flamethrowers had become the essential weapon for reducing Japanese fortified positions. Every Marine battalion commander was requesting flame support for assaults on cave systems and pillboxes. The portable M2 flamethrowers proved effective but suffered from severe limitations that casualties among operators only intensified. The solution emerged from Navy Seabees, operating a secret flame weapon development program at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. Colonel Unmacht's top-secret flamethrower group had been developing mechanized flamethrowers mounted on Sherman tanks since mid-1944. The concept addressed every limitation of portable flamethrowers through engineering scale and armored protection. 8 M4A3 Sherman medium tanks were converted for Operation Detachment, the codename for Iwo Jima, invasion. Seabees from the 117th Naval Construction Battalion worked continuously to install the CBH-1 flamethrower system, which represented a synthesis of the best features from 3 different flame weapon designs. The Ronson flamethrower, the Navy Model I, and captured components from earlier systems were combined into a weapon that transformed tactical possibilities. The installation required 150 pounds of welding rod and 1,100 individual electrical connections. Each conversion cost between $20,000 and $25,000, equivalent to approximately $300,000 in current value. The investment reflected desperate urgency, as commanders recognized that Iwo Jima would require flame weapons on a scale never before employed in Pacific combat. The CBH-1 system operated at 300 pounds per square inch pressure, nearly triple the pressure of portable flamethrowers. This provided effective range of 150 feet, more than 7 times the range of the M2 backpack system. The flamethrower replaced the tank's main 75mm gun, but retained machine guns for anti-personnel defense. Fuel capacity reached 290 gallons, providing sustained firing capability that portable systems could never approach. Most critically, the The Sherman's armor protected the crew and fuel system from the rifle and machine gun fire that killed portable flamethrower operators with devastating efficiency. Japanese defenders could observe flame tanks approaching their positions, but lacked weapons capable of destroying them before the flamethrowers came within effective range. All 8 flame tanks landed on Iwo Jima during the first day, but remained uncommitted until the second day of fighting, while commanders assessed optimal employment tactics. Once their effectiveness became apparent, demand exceeded supply immediately. Marine units held up advances specifically to wait for flame tank support, understanding that assaulting hardened positions without flame weapons meant accepting casualties that proper support could prevent. The tanks operated from a central pool rather than being permanently assigned to specific units. As battles progressed across the island, flame tanks would dispatch from refueling locations to whichever unit requested support, engage targets until fuel exhausted, then return to rearm before deploying to the next mission. The system maximized utilization of scarce resources while ensuring flame support remained available across the entire front. Marines gave the flame tanks nicknames that reflected both affection and recognition of their effectiveness. Zippo tanks, after the popular cigarette lighter brand. Satans, for the hellfire they projected. The Japanese referred to them as M1 tanks, possibly due to mistranslation of the MH1 designation, though survivors' accounts suggest Japanese troops simply called them the fire tanks, with a terror that transcended technical nomenclature. The psychological impact of flame tanks exceeded their physical destructive capability. Japanese defenders, who had withstood days of naval bombardment and aerial attack, who had fought with fanatical determination against rifle and artillery fire, broke and ran when flame tanks appeared. The sight of a Sherman tank approaching with flames erupting from its turret created panic that conventional weapons could not generate. Marine after-action reports documented behavior among Japanese defenders that departed radically from their typical combat discipline. Soldiers who had occupied reinforced positions for days suddenly abandoned fortifications and fled into the open when flame tanks approached. Defenders committed suicide rather than face death by burning. Some Japanese soldiers who survived flame tank attacks later reported that the weapon's psychological presence exceeded even its devastating physical effects. Captain Frank Caldwell, company commander with the 26th Marines, provided assessment that summarized flame tank impact with brutal clarity. In my view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle. The tanks consumed approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm daily once commanders understood their effectiveness. This represented sustained industrial support that demonstrated American logistical superiority as clearly as any technological advancement. Japanese defenders possessed no equivalent weapon and no means of countering flame tanks once they came within effective range. Yet the battle continued with grinding intensity that exceeded every previous Pacific campaign. Mount Suribachi fell on February 26th, after 5 days of combat that should have taken hours, according to pre-invasion planning. The 2 Jima flag raisings on February 23rd had provided symbolic victory that masked tactical reality. The mountain represented bare 10% of the island's area and perhaps 15% of its defensive fortifications. The northern portion of Iwo Jima contained terrain that transformed into a defender's paradise. Broken volcanic rock formations created natural defensive positions requiring minimal improvement. The elaborate tunnel network, Kuribayashi, had constructed connected positions across the entire northern sector, allowing Japanese troops to reinforce threatened areas and maintain cohesive defense despite overwhelming American firepower superiority. Specific terrain features became focal points for battles that consumed days and generated casualties measured in hundreds. Hill 382, a volcanic prominence in the island's center, anchored Japanese defensive lines. Marines nicknamed the surrounding terrain the meat grinder for casualties sustained attempting to capture positions that Japanese defenders reinforced through tunnels faster than American forces could destroy them. The Mixed Amphitheater, a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by volcanic ridges, became another killing ground where Japanese observers directed artillery and mortar fire onto marine formations, attempting to advance across terrain that provided minimal cover. Turkey Knob, a distinctive rock formation, housed artillery positions that remained operational despite repeated attempts to destroy them with naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. Each defensive position required individual reduction through combined arms tactics that placed marine infantry at point-blank range with defenders who would fight to the death. Flamethrowers became the essential weapon for every assault. Portable M2 units suppressed positions that flame tanks could not reach due to terrain limitations. Flame tanks engaged larger cave systems and bunker complexes that required sustained flame application to ensure complete neutralization. The process of cave clearing developed into systematic procedures refined through bitter experience. Marine assault teams would approach a cave entrance under covering fire from rifles, machine guns, and tanks positioned to suppress adjacent positions. Demolition teams would seal alternative entrances if tunnel intelligence suggested multiple access points. Then, flamethrower operators would engage the primary entrance with sustained bursts designed to consume oxygen and kill defenders through asphyxiation, even if flames did not directly contact them. Some caves required multiple flame attacks over several hours to ensure complete clearance. Japanese defenders deep within tunnel systems could survive initial flame bursts by retreating to interior chambers where rock walls provided thermal protection. Follow-up attacks with satchel charges and demolition materials would seal entrances to prevent reoccupation, while Marines advanced to the next position. The grinding attrition generated casualties that exceeded pre-invasion estimates by factors that should have been impossible. By March 1st, 11 days into the battle, Marine casualties had reached 10,000 with no end to fighting in sight. Japanese defenders continued fighting with determination that showed no signs of collapse despite ammunition shortages, water deprivation, and casualties that had reduced garrison strength by perhaps 30%. Medical evacuation procedures struggled to keep pace with casualty flow. Hospital ships offshore received wounded at rates that overwhelmed surgical facilities. Corpsmen on the beaches worked under Japanese artillery fire to stabilize wounded for evacuation. The volcanic ash that covered everything complicated wound treatment as fine particles contaminated injuries and increased infection risk. Yet American forces continued advancing through sheer material superiority that Japanese defenders could not match. Artillery ammunition supplies remained adequate despite enormous expenditure rates. Naval gunfire support never diminished regardless of shells fired. Aerial attacks continued whenever weather permitted. Most importantly, replacement troops arrived to fill casualties among frontline units, while Japanese garrison strength declined irreversibly with each day of combat. March 10th marked 3 weeks since the invasion began. Marine units had advanced to the island's northern shoreline in several sectors, effectively bisecting Japanese defensive zones. Yet, isolated pockets of resistance continued fighting with intensity that defied tactical logic. Kuribayashi's defensive philosophy of maximizing American casualties, regardless of strategic outcome, remained in effect even as Japanese defeat became mathematically certain. The final phase of the battle concentrated on clearing the northwestern portion of the island, where broken terrain provided optimal defensive positions. A 700-yard box canyon became known simply as the Gorge or Death Valley to Marines assigned to clear it. 500 Japanese defenders occupied interconnected cave systems throughout the canyon walls, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. The reduction of the gorge required more than a week of continuous combat that exemplified the brutal close-quarters nature of Iwo Jima fighting. M4 Sherman tanks, equipped with bulldozer blades, cut roads into contested areas under direct fire from Japanese positions. Tanks and half-tracks positioned at point-blank range fired 75mm guns into cave entrances identified by infantry reconnaissance. Flame tanks proved essential for clearing positions that conventional weapons could not reach. The longer range of mechanized flamethrowers allowed engagement from distances that provided some protection from Japanese defensive fire. Multiple flame attacks on individual caves over several hours ensured complete neutralization, even when defenders retreated to interior chambers. Marines broadcast surrender appeals in Japanese using loudspeakers and leaflets. The appeals emphasized that surrender would result in humane treatment according to international law. Water and food would be provided. Medical treatment for wounded guaranteed. The appeals went almost universally ignored. Japanese defenders chose death over surrender with consistency that demonstrated the effectiveness of military indoctrination and cultural conditioning that portrayed surrender as ultimate dishonor. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi sent his final message to Imperial headquarters on March 17th. The text, accompanied by 3 traditional death poems, acknowledged defeat while praising his garrison's performance. Since the enemy's landing, the gallant fighting of the men under my command has been such that even the gods would weep. In particular, I humbly rejoice in the fact that they have continued to fight bravely, though utterly empty-handed and ill-equipped against a land, sea, and air attack of a material superiority such as surpasses the imagination. The poems reflected subtle protest against military leadership that had sent men to die in battles they could not win. Kuribayashi understood that Iwo Jima's defense, however skillful, merely delayed inevitable defeat. His final instructions to surviving troops emphasized that they should continue fighting to maximize American casualties, rather than pursue any illusion of victory. On March 23rd, 6 days after his farewell message, Kuribayashi radioed a final transmission to Major Hori at Chichijima. All officers and men of Chichijima, goodbye from Iwo. Major Hori attempted to re-establish contact for 3 days, but received no response. The general had likely died during this period, either from artillery fire during a final attack or by his own hand to avoid capture. The United States declared Iwo Jima secure on March 26th after 36 days of combat. The declaration represented operational necessity rather than tactical reality. An estimated 3,000 Japanese defenders remained alive throughout the island's cave systems, continuing resistance that would persist for months after the official battle ended. Marine casualties totaled 26,039, including approximately 7,000 killed in action. This represented the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese losses. The ratio reflected Kuribayashi's defensive philosophy executed with brutal effectiveness. Each Japanese defender had killed or wounded more than one American, validating the tactical approach even as strategic defeat remained inevitable. Japanese casualties reached approximately 21,000, with only 216 prisoners captured during the battle. The survival rate of barely 1% demonstrated the effectiveness of Japanese military conditioning and the consequences of defensive tactics that prioritized attrition over survival. The aftermath of Iwo Jima generated controversy that persists among military historians. Retired Chief of Naval Operations William Pratt publicly stated that the island was useless to the Army as a staging base and useless to the Navy as a fleet base. The strategic justification for accepting 26,000 casualties to capture 8 square miles of volcanic rock remained debatable. Yet operational results validated the invasion regardless of strategic debate. During the remaining months of the war, 2,400 B-29 superfortresses made emergency landings on Iwo Jima. Each aircraft carried 11-man crews who would likely have perished if the island remained in Japanese hands. The simple mathematics of aircrew lives saved versus Marine casualties sustained suggested the invasion prevented net American casualties even before considering other operational benefits. P-51 Mustang fighters based on Iwo Jima escorted bombing missions over Japan, dramatically reducing B-29 losses to Japanese interceptors. The psychological impact of American fighters appearing over Japanese cities demonstrated that the home islands lay within range of sustained attack, contributing to civilian morale collapse that facilitated eventual surrender. The flame weapons that proved essential for victory at Iwo Jima continued serving in subsequent Pacific operations. Okinawa, invaded on April 1, 1945, presented defensive terrain even more formidable than Iwo Jima. Japanese forces employed similar cave-based defensive tactics that made flame weapons critical for reducing fortified positions. The United States Army, which had largely left flamethrower development to the Marine Corps, recognized flame weapon importance after Iwo Jima results became available. Army commanders requested 54 mechanized flamethrowers for the projected invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November 1945. The planned assault on the Japanese home islands assumed flame weapons would prove essential for reducing defensive positions around every city and town. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 eliminated need for the Kyushu invasion. Yet military planning documents revealed that flame weapons had become fundamental to American assault tactics against Japanese defenders. The lessons learned at Iwo Jima would have been applied at vastly larger scale across the Japanese home islands if conventional invasion had proceeded. For the Marines who survived Iwo Jima, the battle remained defining experience that shaped their understanding of combat for the remainder of their lives. Veterans spoke of the island with mixture of pride and horror that reflected the intense violence of 36 days of continuous fighting. The volcanic ash, the sulfur smell, the sound of flamethrowers engaging caves, these sensory memories persisted across decades. Corporal Hershel Williams received the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman on October 5, 1945. The citation documented his 4-hour engagement on February 23, specifically noting his elimination of 7 pillboxes while operating alone after his covering force became casualties. Williams became one of 27 Marines who received the Medal of Honor for actions on Iwo Jima. Only 14 survived to receive the medal. The casualty rate among medal recipients mirrored the horrific casualties across the entire battle. Williams lived to age 98, passing away on June 29, 2022. He spent decades after the war speaking about his Iwo Jima experiences, always emphasizing that he survived through fortune rather than exceptional skill. The flamethrower, he insisted, was simply the weapon available when his battalion needed someone to suppress pillboxes. Any Marine would have done the same if assigned the mission. This humility characterized many Iwo Jima veterans who understood that survival often depended on random chance, rather than tactical skill or personal courage. A bullet deflected by volcanic rock, a mortar shell landing 3 feet left instead of 3 feet right, an artillery barrage ending 30 seconds before a Marine emerged from cover. The accumulation of small fortunes determined who survived and who died on an island where tactical competence and personal bravery proved insufficient to guarantee survival. The flamethrower itself continued serving American forces through the Korean War and into Vietnam. The basic M2 design evolved into improved variants that addressed specific limitations identified through combat experience. The M2A-2, modified during the Korean War, featured straight-sided backpack frames, vented gas caps, and additional safety valves. The weapon remained in Marine Corps inventory into the 1960s, despite official procurement of newer systems. Vietnam presented unique employment scenarios that validated flamethrower effectiveness under conditions its designers never anticipated. The tunnel complexes beneath Cu Chi and the Iron Triangle recreated the confined space combat that had characterized Iwo Jima. Tunnel rats, volunteers who explored enemy tunnels to destroy storage facilities and command posts, relied on pistols and flamethrowers as primary weapons in underground environments where rifles proved too cumbersome. The psychological impact of flamethrowers on Vietnamese defenders mirrored Japanese reactions 20 years earlier. Viet Cong soldiers who survived tunnel encounters reported terror at the weapon's effects in confined spaces. The sound, the heat, the consumption of oxygen, all combined to create fear that conventional weapons could not generate. Yet by the 1970s, flamethrowers were being phased out of American military inventory in favor of newer systems. The M202 Flash, an incendiary rocket launcher, offered similar effects with reduced operator vulnerability. Improved demolition charges, thermobaric weapons provided alternative means of destroying fortified positions. The tactical niche that flamethrowers had filled for 3 decades gradually disappeared as technology advanced. The last American military flamethrowers left service in the 1980s, The weapon that had proven essential for victory at Iwo Jima became obsolete through technological advancement rather than tactical inadequacy. Modern warfare increasingly emphasized standoff engagement at ranges where flamethrowers offered no advantage. Urban combat techniques evolved toward precision application of force rather than area suppression through flame. The story of how a 70-pound backpack weapon became essential for capturing an 8-square-mile island ultimately affirms that tactical effectiveness emerges from matching weapon capabilities to specific battlefield requirements. The flamethrower succeeded at Iwo Jima because Japanese defensive tactics created situations where no other weapon could achieve necessary effects. The elaborate cave systems and reinforced fortifications that Suribachi constructed represented sophisticated defensive engineering optimized against conventional weapons. Naval bombardment could not reach underground positions. Artillery lacked precision to engage narrow cave entrances. Tank cannon rounds could not penetrate firing slits designed to defeat direct fire. Rifle grenades lacked blast effect to kill defenders in hardened positions. Only flamethrowers could project lethal effects through small openings into confined spaces, where defenders sheltered from conventional weapons. Only flamethrowers could consume oxygen in underground chambers, asphyxiating defenders even when flames did not contact them. Only flamethrowers generated psychological terror sufficient to force Japanese troops from positions they would otherwise defend to the death. The weapon's effectiveness emerged from physics and human psychology rather than technological sophistication. Burning liquid sticks to surfaces and continues burning at temperatures that make survival impossible. Oxygen consumption in confined spaces kills through asphyxiation faster than many realize. The terror of burning alive overrides training and discipline in ways that other forms of death do not. These principles, understood by weapons designers in 1943, remained valid through the weapon's entire service life. Improvements in fuel composition and ignition systems enhanced reliability and range. Mounting flamethrowers on armored vehicles reduced operator casualties and increased fuel capacity. But the fundamental mechanism of effect, burning liquid projected into confined spaces, never changed because the physics of fire and human vulnerability to thermal injury remained constant. For Japanese defenders at Iwo Jima, the flamethrower represented the collision of their defensive philosophy with a weapon specifically suited to counter it. Suribachi's strategy of underground defense maximized American casualties against conventional weapons while creating perfect vulnerability to the one weapon that Japanese doctrine had not adequately considered. The irony would have been apparent to Suribachi had he survived to analyze battle results. His 8 months of preparation, his elaborate tunnel systems, his carefully positioned fortifications, all of these measures created defensive positions that flamethrowers could defeat more effectively than positions defended using traditional tactics. Underground chambers that provided perfect protection from artillery became death traps when flamethrowers projected burning liquid through entrances. Ventilation systems essential for extended occupation became vulnerabilities when flames consumed oxygen throughout the tunnel network. The mathematical precision of defensive engineering created mathematical vulnerability to specific countermeasures. Every improvement in fortification design increased susceptibility to flame attack. Thicker walls and narrower openings concentrated defenders in confined spaces where oxygen consumption proved lethal. Multiple entrances connected by tunnels allowed flame effects to propagate throughout defensive systems. Ventilation shafts designed to support extended occupation became chimneys, drawing flames into interior chambers. Japanese military doctrine had emphasized defensive engineering as counter to American material superiority. If fortifications could withstand naval bombardment and aerial attack, Japanese defenders could inflict casualties sufficient to make American victory prohibitively costly, even if strategic defeat remained inevitable. The logic appeared sound based on previous battle experience at Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, where fortified positions had generated horrific American casualties. What Japanese planners had not adequately considered was American capacity to develop specific countermeasures to identify tactical problems. Flamethrowers existed before Iwo Jima, but their tactical employment at scale, combined with mechanized variants that addressed range and vulnerability limitations, represented American industrial and doctrinal flexibility that Japanese military culture struggled to match. The United States could afford to develop specialized weapons for specific tactical requirements because industrial capacity supported diverse research programs. Chemical warfare service engineers could experiment with fuel compositions and ignition systems. Navy Seabees could convert Sherman tanks into flame weapons using resources that exceeded entire Japanese military research budgets. Marine Corps doctrine could rapidly incorporate lessons learned from previous battles to develop combined arms tactics optimized for reducing fortified positions. This systematic approach to tactical problem-solving, supported by industrial abundance that Japanese empire could not match, created decisive advantages that accumulated across every phase of combat. Flamethrowers represented one example among many where American forces identified enemy defensive tactics, developed specific countermeasures, then deployed those countermeasures at scale sufficient to achieve operational effects. For the individual Marines who carried M2 flamethrowers into combat, these strategic considerations meant nothing. They understood only that their weapon drew concentrated enemy fire, that their life expectancy measured in minutes once combat commenced, and that their role was essential for mission success, regardless of personal survival probability. The 92% casualty rate among flamethrower operators at Iwo Jima documented in brutal statistics what these Marines experienced viscerally. Walking toward enemy positions with 70 pounds of flammable liquid on your back, while Japanese machine guns concentrated fire on your distinctive silhouette, required courage that transcended normal military discipline. It required acceptance of near-certain death in service of tactical objectives that might be accomplished by the next operator if you failed. Corporal Williams survived 4 hours of continuous combat that should have killed him within the first 30 minutes. His covering force died. He fought alone. Bullets ricocheted off his fuel tanks without igniting them through fortune that cannot be explained by engineering design. Japanese soldiers charged him with fixed bayonets and died in flames before reaching hand-to-hand distance. The accumulation of unlikely survivals across 4 hours of maximum intensity combat suggests either extraordinary fortune or divine intervention, depending on personal belief systems. Williams himself attributed survival to fortune rather than skill, acknowledging honestly that competent execution of flamethrower tactics merely gave fortune opportunity to operate. Incompetent execution guaranteed death. Competent execution made survival possible without ensuring it. This humble assessment of personal performance characterized many Medal of Honor recipients who understood that courage and skill created necessary conditions for mission success without guaranteeing personal survival. The medal recognized both achievement and survival, honoring not merely tactical effectiveness, but the fortune that allowed recipients to live when so many equally deserving Marines died. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The legacy of flamethrowers at Iwo Jima extends beyond tactical lessons toward fundamental questions about weapons and warfare ethics. Flamethrowers generate visceral horror that other weapons do not produce, despite causing objectively less suffering than many conventional alternatives. A soldier burned to death suffers intensely but briefly. A soldier with abdominal wounds from artillery shrapnel may suffer for hours or days before dying, yet flamethrowers evoke moral condemnation that artillery does not. This psychological distinction reveals human responses to warfare that transcend rational assessment of weapon effects. Fire carries primal terror encoded in human psychology across millennia of evolution. We fear burning with intensity that exceeds fear of other forms of death, even when objective suffering proves less severe. This evolutionary legacy makes flamethrowers psychologically effective beyond their physical capabilities. Japanese defenders at Iwo Jima, who abandoned positions when flame tanks approached, demonstrated this psychological vulnerability. They had withstood artillery bombardment that inflicted objectively more casualties. They had fought against rifle fire that killed more defenders overall. But the sight of flames erupting from a Sherman tank created panic that other weapons could not generate, because fire triggers psychological responses that bypass rational assessment of tactical situation. Modern military forces have largely abandoned flamethrowers, not because they became tactically ineffective, but because their psychological impact generated political costs that exceeded tactical benefits. International pressure against weapons perceived as causing unnecessary suffering led to gradual phase-out, even as alternative weapons produced objectively greater casualties. The distinction reflected political realities rather than military effectiveness or humanitarian outcomes. The Marines who fought at Iwo Jima possessed no luxury of political or ethical consideration. They faced tactical problems requiring immediate solutions using available weapons regardless of psychological impact on enemy or political perception among civilian populations. Flamethrowers provided necessary capability for reducing fortified positions that conventional weapons could not defeat. The alternatives were accepting prohibitive casualties or failing to accomplish assigned missions. This brutal calculus of tactical necessity characterized the entire Pacific War, where Japanese defensive tactics forced American commanders to choose between accepting horrific casualties or employing weapons that maximized enemy suffering to minimize American losses. The flamethrower at Iwo Jima exemplified this choice in its most stark form, a weapon that generated terror exceeding its physical destructive power, that killed through oxygen deprivation as often as direct flame contact. That created psychological effects on enemy defenders that conventional weapons could not match. That saved American lives by forcing enemy surrender or death with efficiency that tactical situation demanded. These contradictions, these uncomfortable truths about weapons and warfare, persist across the 80 years since Iwo Jima. We honor the Marines who carried flamethrowers into combat. We recognize the tactical necessity of their actions. We acknowledge the courage required to operate weapons that guaranteed near-certain death for their operators. Yet we also recognize the horror of warfare, reduced to its most primal form. Man killing man with fire in confined spaces beneath volcanic rock on an island whose strategic importance remained debatable. The mathematics of lives saved versus casualties sustained can be calculated. The ethical questions raised by those calculations resist definitive answers. Corporal Hershel Williams embodied these contradictions through his long life after Iwo Jima, a humble West Virginia farm boy who became a terrifying destroyer of Japanese defenders. A Medal of Honor recipient who insisted he merely did his assigned mission. A veteran who spent decades speaking about his wartime experiences while emphasizing that survival resulted from fortune rather than exceptional ability. His passing in 2022 marked the end of an era. The last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from Iwo Jima, the final living connection to a battle that exemplified both heroism and horror in ways that subsequent generations struggle to comprehend. The flamethrowers that won Iwo Jima have passed into history along with the Marines who carried them. The weapon has been declared obsolete. The tactical requirements it addressed have been solved through alternative technologies. The combat that required its employment belongs to a past that contemporary military forces study as history rather than operational template. Yet the lessons persist. Tactical effectiveness emerges from matching weapon capabilities to specific battlefield requirements. Defensive engineering that optimizes against conventional threats creates vulnerability to specialized countermeasures. Industrial capacity to develop and deploy specific solutions to identified problems produces decisive advantages across every domain of warfare. And most fundamentally, courage and sacrifice by individual soldiers remains essential regardless of technological advancement or doctrinal sophistication. The Marines who carried flamethrowers into Japanese pillboxes at Iwo Jima understood these truths through experience that transcended academic analysis. They knew that their weapon was essential. They accepted near-certain death as price of tactical effectiveness. They fought with determination that honored their fallen comrades, and justified the faith their commanders placed in their abilities. This simple equation of duty, sacrifice, and mission accomplishment sustained them through 36 days of combat that remain unmatched in Marine Corps history for sustained intensity and horrific casualties. The flamethrowers they carried became symbols of both tactical necessity and the terrible cost of victory against an enemy who would fight to the death from positions specifically designed to maximize American casualties. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima has settled over battles fought 8 decades ago. The Marines who fought there have almost all passed into history alongside the Japanese defenders they killed. The tactical innovations developed during that battle have been superseded by modern technologies and doctrines. But the fundamental truth endures. When soldiers face tactical problems that conventional weapons cannot solve, they require specialized tools regardless of cost or controversy. The flamethrower at Iwo Jima represented such a tool, employed by Marines who accepted its burdens because tactical necessity demanded solutions that only they could provide. Their courage in carrying those weapons into combat, their sacrifice when enemy fire struck them down, their determination to accomplish missions regardless of survival probability, these qualities define military service across all eras and all conflicts. The story of Iwo Jima and the flamethrowers that proved essential for victory stands as testament to both the horror of warfare and the courage of those who fight regardless of costs demanded by tactical necessity. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching,